Hey, 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 how's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing well tonight. This is hopefully, one of your favorite authors, J.A. Faulkerson, coming to you tonight again to deliver another episode of Culturally Coded Book Talks. Now, the last time I was on screen, we went through the prologue and also chapter one of my debut novel, Adinkrahene, Fear of a Black Planet. So I want to continue to read this debut novel tonight. But just to refresh everybody's memory, during the last episode, I talked about, you heard an unpublished excerpt from Frederick Douglass's American Slave Narrative. We witnessed the murder of Mary Giles, who's the grandmother, who's Selena Giles' grandmother. And we also met Jonathan Frazier, who's the main character of my novel. And he's a political reporter with the Washington Post. So tonight we're going to be reading chapters 2 and 3. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of dive right in and kind of give you a feel for what chapter 2 has to offer. Now, this chapter 2 is chapter 2, Kelly Schuler. So she's another character. And as you saw from my last episode, anytime I read like chapter 1, Jonathan Frazier, or chapter 2, Kelly Schuler, me stating the name after I mentioned the chapter is actually letting you know that the chapter is from the perspective of that character. So tonight is the first chapter I'm reading tonight is chapter 2, Kelly Schuler. So this chapter is going to be from the perspective of Kelly Schuler. Chapter 2, Kelly Schuler. I had been doing my best to avoid Jonathan, but I must admit it felt good seeing him at Daddy's press conference. When I saw him, memories of our time together flashed through my mind. That last time when we were walking along the pier in Ocean City, Maryland, was special. For the first time in our month-long affair, I had felt a real connection with him. But this connection was nothing more than that, a feeling. Jonathan Frazier just couldn't handle being with a young, intelligent white woman, and I hate him for that. Yes, he was 43, I 25, but when he told me that I should be dating men closer to my age, I wanted to slap him across his face. I told him right then and there that I am a grown-ass woman, but he wasn't buying it. Dropping me was probably convenient for him. I wasn't surprised to see him talking with Selena in the hallway after Daddy's press conference. I should have followed Daddy's advice. He never knew that Jonathan and I were sleeping with each other. If he did, he probably would have had a fit. Daddy is a byproduct of the old South. He would rather I mix it up with the young male senators and representatives that frequented the Blair House Country Club. Of course, I would have had a problem with that. Hanging out with guys who place the health of their investment portfolios above me is not my cup of tea. I always knew Jonathan wasn't getting rich down at the Post. Last I heard, the Rag's top reporters were making around $70,000 a year, but he is one of the most respected journalists in the business. When my papa, Watson Schuler, retired from the Senate, Jonathan wrote an excellent piece on him that chronicled his 4 terms as Mississippi senator and 2 terms as Mississippi governor. It was during the interviews he conducted in Jackson with members of my family that we met. I was impressed by his kind demeanor and good looks. My folks, however, were enamored by his celebrity. Jonathan Frazier will always be remembered as the Tennessee volunteer shooting guard who took it to the Ole Miss Rebels in the 1990 Southeastern Conference men's basketball championship game. With 5.4 seconds on the clock, Jonathan reportedly faked a jump shot before stepping behind the three-point line to sink a 3. The Vols won 61-59, advancing to the first round of the NCAA tournament. They give that man too much credit, Daddy complained as we entered his office in the bowels of the Russell Senate office building. Newsom and the goddamn Democrats are the problem, not us. He strode to the other side of his mahogany desk to sit in his plush leather chair. Kelly, mark my word, Herbert Newsom is going to regret signing that executive order. I replied, I agree. It was a stupid thing to do. More Republicans should have been at the table. Immigration is supposed to be a bipartisan issue. Roscoe Baker, my father's longtime friend, confidant, and deputy chief of staff, strode into the room. I sat in one of the four chairs surrounding a rectangular mahogany table. As I did, I strained to read the business card in his right hand. On the side facing me, I briefly saw the word "we" written in blue ink. Kelly, can you give us a minute? Mr. Roscoe said with deep concern. I stood. Sure, just let me know when you're done. I still have some questions about the highway bill. Sure thing. While at my desk, I repeatedly peered over the top of my computer monitor, sneaking glances at them as he talked on the other side of the glass behind a closed door. Mr. Roscoe was more animated than usual. Daddy sat behind his desk with a contemplative expression on his face. At first, I surmised that their discussion centered around Congress's low poll numbers. But when Mr. Roscoe waved the card inches from Daddy's face, I realized they never stopped talking about the card. Daddy's office door swung open, and there he was, standing in the doorway. Kelly, he said, come on back in here, doll. When we were all holed up in his office, Daddy continued. You still corresponding with that black reporter down at the Post? He asked. You mean Jonathan? I replied. Yeah, that's him, Mr. Roscoe interrupted. Daddy rolled his eyes at his friend before looking back at me. If we're going to win this election, he continued, we'll need the help of some good niggers. He breathed in deeply. I need you to draw that boy out in conversation a little more. Determine if he's conservative, liberal, or somewhere in the middle. Why? Because of this. With a nod of his head, he invoked Mr. Roscoe to hand me the business card that he held in his right hand. That he simultaneously pulled a stack of others from his desk drawer. He spread them out near the front of his desk like a deck of playing cards. I learned that the word following "we" is no. I flipped it over to see what appeared to be a symbol, a smaller red circle surrounded by two larger ones. Got some niggers playing mind games with me, honey, Daddy continued, trying to deter me from running for president, but it's not going to work. But what does any of this have to do with Jonathan? Probably nothing, Mr. Roscoe interjected, but he may help us draw them out into the open. He may also know what this symbol means. I took a second look at the symbol. I've seen it before down at the Smithsonian back in 2006 during Papaw's retirement party. If I'm not mistaken, it's some kind of African symbol, but I forget what it means. I retrieved the stack of cards from Daddy's desk, reading the backs of each one. They all said the same thing. We know. Glad to see Selena showed up, Mr. Roscoe added. Didn't get a chance to speak with her. She looked pissed. May want to see if she can make heads or tails out of this one. Yes. Daddy snuck a glance at me, returning his attention to Mr. Roscoe. Do that. She has always been a reliable foot soldier. Daddy then sat behind his desk, hands folded. His demeanor unsettled me. His eyes came to rest on me. We need you to charm Frazier's socks off, Kelly. There are plenty of conservative-minded niggers out there, niggers who feel Newsom's economic policies are wrong for America. A respected nigger reporter like Jonathan could help us make the case for why nigger voters should vote for me. I winced at the thought of misleading Jonathan just so he could work on my father's behalf. But my family had a legacy to leave behind, and I was willing to do my part to preserve it. Thaddeus, my African-American driver, opened the limousine door for me as I exited the Senate building. He greeted me with a head nod as I passed in front of him to get into the back seat. He had been my driver for over 4 years, a graduation gift from my father. I appreciated these kinds of gifts because I didn't have an appetite for driving home after 5 and all that congestion. My hope then was the traffic wouldn't be that thick once we merged onto the freeway. With my watch registered 9:15 p.m., many of the commuters should have been sitting comfortably in their homes by now, watching the Redskins-Cowboys game. Thaddeus and I didn't say much to each other. We never did. But when I wanted to deviate from the route that took us to my penthouse apartment in Georgetown, I usually called an hour in advance to let him know. But that night, I opted to stay the course. I just wanted to get home, take a jacuzzi bath, dry off, lotion up real good, and then lie naked on my linen bed sheets as an old black and white movie played in the background. I scrolled through the day's CNN newsfeed on my smartphone as Thaddeus weaved the limousine through traffic. All right, so that's chapter 3, or excuse me, that's chapter 2. So we're going to move into chapter 3. So you got a chance to meet Kelly Schuler, who's the daughter of Kyle Schuler. And again, Watson Schuler is the grandfather. And you also had Roscoe Baker, who, if you remember, he was also in chapter 1. He was one of the boys that was with Kyle Schuler during the murder of Mary Giles. So what I want to do now is I want to move into chapter 3. And chapter 3 is going to be, we're going back to Jonathan Fraser's perspective. So, and that's one thing that I do in a lot of my stories, or really this story, is I like going back and forth between characters and speaking the first person as opposed to the second or third person. And I feel like as a writer, I really like writing in the first person just because it gives you're actually seeing things through the eyes of that character who you're talking about. Now, we can take this omnipotent view of, writing stories and things like that, where you actually get a chance to see everything that goes on in that universe. But, and then, and also the first person does have certain limitations. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but just know that I like writing from the perspective of the characters that inhabit my story. And that's what I try to do in this book. And when I write books 2 and 3, I'll probably do the same. But here's chapter 3, and it's Jonathan Fraser. After taking a hot shower and slipping into my pajama bottoms, I plopped into the rolling chair in my home office and pressed the power button on my laptop. The anticipation of learning more about the Adinkrahene symbol was getting to me. Of all the African Adinkra symbols, Adinkrahene is chief among them. 3 words that were associated with it are greatness, charisma, and leadership. Sounds great, but I still wasn't seeing the correlation between it and Kyle Schuler. I walked over to the kitchen island to retrieve the card that Selena gave me. I returned to my office comparing the image on the card with the one on the computer screen. They were identical. I then flipped the card over to take another look at the telephone number. I noted that the number had 7 digits, not 10. If I made this call, there was no way of knowing the area that I called. I plucked my cordless phone from its cradle and then punched in the numbers. 3 rings, a clicking sound, followed by what appeared to be a computerized female voice on the other end. State your first and last name, please, the computerized voice commanded. Jonathan Fraser, I replied. More clicking sounds on the other end. Welcome to the ARMS network, Mr. Fraser, the computerized voice continued. Thank you for following through with Agent Giles' instructions. More clicking sounds. You are 1 step closer to having the answers that you seek, but before we proceed, are you in or out? I was somewhat reluctant to give an answer. Here I was talking to a computer, and I'm being asked if I'm in or out. I'm in, I replied. More clicking sounds. The computerized voice then asked, do you have pen and paper? I opened my desk drawer to grab a ballpoint pen and a stack of sticky notes. Yes, I do. Your questions will be answered at, I scribbled the Potomac, Maryland address as well as the meeting date and time on the sticky note. The computerized voice provided this information 2 more times, and then the call was dropped. I had visited Potomac on numerous occasions, usually to conduct interviews with legislators, judges, diplomats, and lobbyists. I knew whomever lived at this address was a person of immense power, profound influence. Jonathan Frazier, I told the black front gate security guard from the driver's seat of my Honda Accord. He stood next to the driver's side door holding a clipboard with the day's scheduled appointments. I'm here for 6 o'clock. Yes, Mr. Frazier, the security guard replied. Mr. Black is expecting you. Please pull forward after I open the gate. Once you pass through the gate, just follow the paved road to the rotary in front of the mansion entryway. Mr. Wallace, the butler, will greet you there. If I had known I would be meeting with world-renowned inventor and venture capitalist Cornelius Black, I would have dressed it up a little more. But there was no turning back. I just hoped he didn't feel slighted because of my semi-casual dress, white t-shirt, black slacks, and dress shoes. At least I had the foresight to hang my houndstooth jacket in the back seat. But considering Mr. Black had been seen in the company of Jay-Z and Diddy, I thought he would give me kudos for looking so hip. For all intents and purposes, Cornelius Black was a freak of nature. At least that's the moniker Black Enterprise magazine attached to him back in 1998. He had secured 65% stake in Holodeck Systems Incorporated, a Black-owned CGI firm based in Van Nuys, California. Mr. Black was the first to recognize that the company was primed to further revolutionize how Hollywood movies were being made. So after Holodeck Systems supplanted George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic 3 years later as innovators in CGI technology, he directed his mostly African-American staff of computer scientists, engineers, programmers, and designers to create holographic conferencing devices for the corporate sector. Today, these holographic devices can be seen hanging from the ceilings of many corporate conference rooms, smaller devices in employee offices. American businessmen use this technology to communicate with holographic representations of their staff members in North and South America, Europe, and other parts of the world. I even learned that Holodeck Systems will be rolling out a version for home users in the fall. I stepped out of the car and found myself being amazed at all the material wealth Cornelius Black had amassed. He was the world's richest man, succeeding oil magnates Harmon and Nigel Bain. The main building on Mr. Black's sprawling estate, the one that I entered, stretched as far as my eyes could see, and the entryway was reminiscent of a 5-star hotel, not a private residence. Pretty impressive for a fellow descendant of African slaves. I walked up to the ornate oak door and pressed the doorbell. The door swung open within seconds. Welcome, Mr. Frazier, Mr. Wallace, a much older African-American gentleman dressed in a black tuxedo with tails said. He waved his left hand forward and then backwards, inviting me to join him inside the mansion. Mr. Black is out back. I stepped inside. He is looking forward to meeting you. Follow me. We exited the mansion through a rear door to step on the stone floor of the back patio. I saw Mr. Black sitting in the foreground at a glass-top table with gold and silver trim. He sported a pair of Oakley sunglasses and was dressed in white athletic shorts, a white holodeck t-shirt, and white K-Swiss sneakers. Centered on the table was a glass container filled to the brim with sweet tea and a bowl of assorted fruit. Two tall glasses with ice and napkins, silverware, and saucers lied at the ready on opposite ends of the table. Mr. Frazier, Mr. Black greeted as he stood. Glad you can pencil me in. I pray you didn't have any problems finding a place. I extended my hand only to have it consumed and vigorously shaken by Mr. Black's. My gaze shifted from him to the panoramic view of Washington. No, sir, I replied. No problems at all. Thank you for the invitation, and please just call me Jonathan. He then directed me to sit across from him at the table. As I pulled at my chair, I found myself admiring the man's physique, 64 years old and in the best shape of his life. Everyone knows that back in 1964, he was one of the first African Americans to play on a Division I collegiate football team. But maintaining this level of fitness at his age was pretty impressive. Both of our chairs were angled toward the city. I expressed envy about his being able to wake up every morning to such a view. I also commended him for being named Time Magazine's Person of the Year for his philanthropic work in the U.S. and Africa. He reportedly used money from his own coffers to build 50 fully funded K-12 schools in 5 years. 5,000 children attended the first 10 alone. Mr. Black reminded me that he attributes his success to the many sacrifices of our African and African American forebears. Growing tired of the small talk, I abruptly told him that I followed Selena's instructions. But what does it all mean? I asked. Adinkrahene, ARMS. It's all very simple, Jonathan, Mr. Black replied. The Adinkrahene Reparations Management Syndicate, or ARMS, is all about returning the African diaspora to global prominence. It's about securing reparations from the American government for centuries of institutionalized slavery and oppression. And in the case of Mary Giles and others, it's about finally being able to bring Jim Crow criminals to justice. But what are its origins? I angled my chair toward Mr. Black and then rested my elbows on the table. And what do you expect me, a journalist, to do to support its efforts? We want you to do what you do best, Jonathan. Write. Write about Kyle Schuler's positions on taxation, education, immigration, healthcare, jobs, and the economy. Ask the kind of questions other reporters are afraid to ask. Get working and middle-class Americans to see how our democracy has been hijacked by what Adinkrahene calls the corporate cabal. What do you mean, corporate cabal? A group of mostly white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant businessmen whose only purpose is to implement and regulate the forces that reinforce Anglo's superiority, minority inferiority. Their plot to control these forces was hatched even before Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you know this how? Through a critical analysis of this country's history of African American exploitation. Back in the day, these white businessmen exploited their ancestors by not paying them for their labor. During the Jim Crow era, they exploited them through dead-end jobs and low wages. Today, they have a vice grip on amateur and professional sports programs. While our Black athletes are being compensated nicely for their efforts, members of the corporate cabal still walk away with close to 3/4 of the profits. But their most damning scheme involves the privatization of the prison industrial complex. We African Americans make up 12% of the general population, yet represent over 50% of those incarcerated in federal prisons. No race of people can be exploited like that and emerge free of emotional scars, Jonathan. Adinkrahene exists to do what the NAACP, the SCLC, the SNCC, and the NUL have been unwilling and unable to do. Return Africans and African Americans to their rightful thrones. Mr. Black stood. Follow me, he admonished. There is so much more to see. Mr. Black led me down a spiral granite staircase surrounded by granite walls with more ornate carvings on them. When we reached the bottom, he opened a section of the wall on his right to reveal a retinal scanning device. I watched as a wide beam of light swept over his right eye. A portion of the wall immediately slid away. We walked down a long hallway as the entrance closed shut behind us. To our left and right were plate glass windows that ran the length of the hallway. Through one of the windows, I spotted 2 Adinkrahene agents, both Black, sitting in cubicles hovering over computer terminals. 3 other Black agents, 2 males, 1 female, sat at a table in the back of the room, chatting with the holographic projections of 2 Black female colleagues. I was amazed at how close the holograms resembled their flesh and blood originals. Mr. Black stopped, affording me the time I needed to look around. This here is one of our operations centers. He pointed at the two black agents staring at the computer monitors. From here and our bases in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East and Australia, we discreetly manipulate the flow of currency. The two men over there are hackers, probably the best in the business. Never knew a computer system they could not gain access to. Mr. Black directed my attention to the holographic conference session. They're finalizing plans for a new sting operation in the United Kingdom. A slight pause. Adinkrahene's reach expands the globe, my friend. The money that we have leveraged to date from international corporations with ties to the slave trade will exceed $14 trillion by the end of 2012. What will those funds be used for, I asked. Reparations, of course. To whom? You, me, people who look like us. But we won't be depositing monies into individual banking accounts or cutting individual checks. No, we're going to use it to revitalize communities of color in America first. And because America is the cradle, and because Africa is the cradle of civilization, we will open a separate account to gain control of some of its most sought after resources. But why? Hasn't the American government done enough to atone for white people's sins? Mr. Black's head snapped toward me as a smirk appeared on his dark face. You and I both know it hasn't. Yes, its most progressive citizens of all hues did rally together in 2008 to elect the first Black president, but the conservative ones, the ones with the most racist of views, are intent on making Herbert Newsom a one-term president. He continued, none of the white presidents that preceded Newsom ever apologized for slavery or Jim Crow. They create reservations for Native Americans and allow them to operate casinos on protected land. They offer sanctuary to the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, but they try to wipe the Black race's pain away with desegregation measures. That's not good enough for me, Jonathan. They owe us more than that. If they're not going to pay up, we have no choice but to take what is owed to us. But aren't you concerned about getting caught? No, I'm not. Not when I consider that the ancestors who endured 20 or more lashes from metal-tipped whips. Not when I flick through the annals of American history and see photographs of our ancestors hanging by their necks from trees. No, I'm not concerned, Jonathan. If anything, I'm more determined than ever to right an injustice that has gone unchecked. Mr. Black folded his arms. Most people, when they're talking politics, think the game is about the interplay between Republicans, Democrats, and independents, conservatives, liberals, and progressives. They're wrong. The political bodies that matter are clustered closer to the color line. White versus Black and everything in between. The corporate cabal would want us to believe that white is pure, incorruptible, Black the complete opposite, impure, corrupt. That's how they keep us in bondage, Jonathan. Adinkrahene is here to show members of the Black diaspora how to break free of their shackles once and for all. He unfolded his arms, sliding his hands into the pockets of his shorts. I leaned against the plate glass wall, stroking my goatee with my right hand as I processed his words. I had to give the man credit. He was a doer, not a talker. But I cringed at the thought of being locked up for being associated with an organization that takes from the rich and gives to the poor. Like everyone else, I rooted for Robin Hood and his merry band of men, but serving a prison sentence wasn't that appealing to me. What do you want me to do? I asked, pushing away from the wall to stand upright with my arms crossed. Help us bring Kyle Schiller's crimes into the open, Mr. Black replied. We received confirmation about a year and a half ago that he was the one who murdered Mary Giles, an initiation rite devised by his father, Watson Schiller, to usher him and two of his friends, Roscoe Baker and Cleet McMullen, into the cabal. Kyle and Roscoe were 18, Cleet 17. Who was the source? Cleet McMullen. One of our agents on assignment at the Adams County Correctional Center in Jackson got him to talk. Must have had a heart-to-heart meeting with Jesus. Told Agent Miles everything. Said Schuler slit Miss Mary's throat. Mr. Black continued, saying, I understand your reluctance, Jonathan. I too had to think twice when Herbert Newsom invited me into the fold more than 20 years ago. My mouth dropped. President Newsom has ties to Adinkrahene? Yes, he came up with the new design for the RMS. I perfected it. As the former president and CEO of Legacy Bank and Trust, the Adinkrahene Council of Elders knew he was the right person to coordinate this effort. The man is a financial genius. And believe me when I say this, Herbert Newsom is the first African-American president because the Adinkrahene Syndicate fully supported his candidacy. Mr. Black chuckled as he watched me shake my head in disbelief. He continued, I know it's a lot to process, but what do you think? You still in? Sure, I replied with some reluctance. I'm a child of the movement. Feels good knowing there are still brothers out there fighting the good fight. He patted me on the back. No doubt, young blood. He then extended his arm toward a door on the other side of the hallway. No doubt. We entered a circular-shaped room that was reminiscent of a library, decorated with antique chairs and tables. Antique bookshelves with classical and contemporary titles hugged the walls. Paintings of Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Martin Luther King Jr. were perched high on these same walls. I noticed other casually dressed blacks, both male and female, sitting at the table sprinkled throughout the spacious room. And to my right, I saw a mahogany door with a glass door and the words computer lab on it. This is our reading room, Mr. Black said, as we approached an older, bespectacled Black female sitting at an oval-shaped desk. We have gone to great lengths to preserve anything written about or by the four men you see hanging on these walls, as well as other African and African-American authors, both past and present. He slapped the top of the checkout counter. And this here is Miss Ruth Jackson, a historian / librarian. Miss Jackson stood. Hello, Cornelius, she said. She extended her hand to me. And hello to you, Mr. Frazier. I shook and released her hand, surprised that someone I've never met knew my name. She continued, I've been following your career for quite some time. Your new book is pretty popular around here. I'd be surprised if we still have a copy on the shelf. Had to order 10 more just to meet agent demand. Music to my ears, I quipped. Mr. Black interjected, Ruth isn't telling you everything, Jonathan. Selena had a lot to do with your being here today, but Miss Jackson here endorsed the idea. We just thought he would be an asset to the Schuler sting, Cornelius. With his being a member of the Congressional Press Pool, Senator Schuler won't expect a thing. And that's why I love you, Ruth, Mr. Black replied. Mr. Black then left me in Miss Jackson's capable hands. Miss Jackson and I retreated to one of the adjacent conference rooms, and she brought me up to speed on Adinkrahene history, occasionally directing my attention to the images of civil rights heroes and sheroes on the LCD screens lining the far wall. According to Miss Jackson, the Adinkrahene Syndicate first came to prominence in 1932 at the height of the Great Depression and the subsequent Second World War. It was the brainchild of Rufus T. Hancock, a Tuskegee Airman. Hancock loved America, but he hated the way he and other Black military personnel were being treated by the United States government and ultimately the white military generals they answered to. When he and other Tuskegee Airmen returned to America after their tours, they didn't receive ticker-tape parades. They were nothing like the white soldiers and airmen that they fought with. Therefore, they were denied entry into white America's good old boy network, which often resulted in access to better educational and vocational opportunities. But Hancock wasn't one to complain about the inequities in American society. Yes, he thought it was wrong for one group to think it was better than all the others, but an unpublished excerpt from Frederick Douglass's slave narratives opened his eyes to grander possibilities for members of the Black diaspora. According to Miss Jackson, this excerpt referenced an encounter that Douglas, Hancock's boyhood hero, had with a green-skinned Satirian named Dagon. Dagon, a human loyalist, took Douglas to his world through something called the Intergalactic Connector. While on Satyria, or the planet, contemporary humans call Mars, Douglas was introduced to beings that lived underground but were light years ahead of humanity in the technology department. He also learned from Dagon, that the Satyrian race was created by Satan for the sole purpose of one day subjugating God's creation, the human race. However, subjugating humanity would not be an easy undertaking, as the Satyrian people were known to die within days upon being exposed to the direct descendants of Eden, the Black race. Ms. Jackson said Dagon told Douglas that God created the man, Adam, in his image from the Garden of Eden's dark sands. God subsequently created the woman, Eve, from one of Adam's ribs. Because God created the first man and woman from Eden's dark sands, their skin color was black, not white. And because they were first and not last, they received the distinct honor of being called God's chosen people. It should be noted that the Garden of Eden was situated somewhere in the jungles of Africa. Douglas wrote that Dagon died within hours of their return to Earth due to his extensive exposure to him, but not before Dagon admonished Douglas to write these things down so the direct descendants of Eden would one day read his words and then strive to understand and fulfill their collective purpose. The first Adinkrahene Council consisted of Hancock and one African American representative each from the other three military branches, Army, Navy, and Marines. Former NCAA President W.E.B. Du Bois served as an advisor to the council and played an instrumental role in laying the groundwork for the organization's first reparations management system. Initially, the RMS was thought to be a legitimate vehicle for recouping what was owed to African Americans past and present. Again, our people had endured 400 years of institutionalized slavery and oppression. It placed a dollar amount on the debt that the United States government owed African Americans. The United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt expressed an unwillingness to distribute cash payments to African Americans. He thought the cash payment measure would be unfair to Americans who were still reeling from the Great Depression. What Hancock and his colleagues didn't know was President Roosevelt was receiving pressure from corporate cabal leaders to end his secret negotiations with NAACP leaders. Du Bois ended his relationship with Adinkrahene when Hancock decided to compete with Chicago's Al Capone for control of alcohol sales during the Prohibition era. Du Bois still had faith President Roosevelt would come to his senses and make a good faith effort to put African Americans on equal footing with Caucasian Americans. Of course, Hancock knew this would never happen. So for 2 years, he siphoned off $500 million from Capone's empire before Capone knew he was being robbed. When Capone realized he was being played for a sucker by the blacks, he ordered that Rufus T. Hancock be taken out. Hancock's side business was in banking, so this position made it easier for him to siphon funds from the amounts he managed for Capone. Unfortunately, the golden era of the Adinkrahene Syndicate ended in 1954 when Rufus T. Hancock Unfortunately, the golden era of the Adinkrahene Syndicate ended in 1954 when Rufus T. Hancock's bruised, bloodied, and mutilated body was found hidden under some trash bags in a Chicago alley. Adinkrahene faded into the shadows in the years following Hancock's death. But one of Hancock's disciples, 38-year-old Bryson Black, resurrected the organizations 11 years later in 1965. His son Cornelius was 18, his daughter Condoleezza, or Condi, 15. His wife was blues songstress India Mason Black, who wooed Black audiences during performances at New York's Cotton Club and Apollo Theater during the 1950s. Like Hancock, Bryson wanted to hear apologies from sitting United States presidents as well as the state governors whose economies were built on the backs of African Americans. He also wanted them to pay these same African Americans for their uncompensated labor and debt of their deceased ancestors. Because he knew the wait time would be long and drawn out, he and the three other council members at the time decided to introduce cocaine and more potent brands of marijuana into American markets. Bryson purchased his supplies from the Mexican drug cartel and made his product available to gang leaders in Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, Dallas, Boston, and New York. Americans of all hues would purchase these drugs from street dealers, but the unintended consequence was the adverse impact their activities had on members of the Black diaspora. A disproportionate amount of these members became users and peddlers, and if and when the peddlers got caught by the authorities, they were the first to be arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and incarcerated. The corporate cabal seemingly perpetuated this inequitable treatment because they thought white lives were more precious than minority ones. Modern-day thought leaders like Michelle Alexander called the mass incarceration of African Americans the new Jim Crow. Bryson Black went on a killing spree in 1968 after learning that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. He loved Dr. King, making a point to always be in the house when Dr. King spoke at one of the New York churches. He had also encouraged Cornelius and Condi to be mindful of Dr. King's words. He has given us the blueprint for a more equitable America, he once told them. The NYPD thought they had a serial killer on their hands because the perpetrator had used a knife to carve MLK on his victims' foreheads. When all of the forensic evidence pointed to Bryson Black, the NYPD moved in to arrest him at his Long Island-based dry cleaning business. But rather than allow himself to be arrested, Bryson retreated to a back room to retrieve his military-grade machine gun. Multiple squad cars had come to screeching halts in front of the building, and officers stood outside with their pistols drawn. Bryson opened fire, pelting the officers with a barrage of bullets. Bryson Black was ultimately shot dead that day, but not before. He took 3 NYPD officers with him. Herbert Newsom inherited the Adinkrahene mantle 2 years later, vowing to fulfill the organization's mandate using methods rooted in strategy and science. He led the Adinkrahene Reparations Management Syndicate for 23 years. In 1991, he handed the Adinkrahene reins to his protege, Cornelius Black. Cornelius was 45. A year later, Newsom became an Illinois senator. After only one 4-year term, he decided to take his skill sets to Washington, D.C., where he served 3 terms in the United States Senate. "Thank you for your time, Miss Jackson," I said as I joined Mr. Black in front of the elevator. "No problem, Jonathan. Just remember, my door is always open. If you have questions or just need information, don't hesitate to stop by. I will. Take care." The elevator doors slid open and we exited. We then entered a gymnasium replete with a regulation-sized basketball court. On the far court, 6 Adinkrahene brothers played a friendly 3-on-3 basketball game. The other half was occupied by several sitting Adinkrahene brothers and sisters dressed in matching dry-fit shorts, shirts, and sneakers. Small Adinkrahene symbols were prominently displayed on the front of their chests or their shirts. 2 other similarly dressed agents with headgear sparred in the center of the mat. Awash as one of the sparring agents, a female adorned with headgear, jumped high into the air to kick a similarly dressed agent in the chest. The other agent, a large male, flew backwards, bouncing at least 2 feet across the mat. The gymnasium erupted with jeers and cheers. The female agent removed her headgear as her dispatched foe sat upright on the mat. When she turned toward Mr. Black and me, I was pleased to see Selena. You ready for this, Jay? She asked. All eyes turned to me. Question is, I replied, are you ready for me? I assumed a squatting stance, my feet spread wide, hands inches from my face. I then heard chuckles from the crowd of Adinkrahene agents. Selena could do no more than shake her head and smile. All right, so that right there that completes my reading for tonight. The next time I log on, the whole goal is to get through the book. So I'll be reading chapter 4. And chapter 4 is going to be told from the perspective of Kyle Schuler, who is our antagonist in the story. So thanks again for tuning in for Culturally Coded Book Talks. I'm trying to think, probably the next 2 or 3 days, I'll have another broadcast, and we'll get a chance to, just read. I may just read one chapter next time, but what you saw tonight is you got a feel for just the history of the Adinkrahene Reparations Management Syndicate, or ARMS. And that right there is really something that I put a lot of thought in, and it's really just a way of, really centralizing my main character, Jonathan, who's actually going to be connected to something much larger than himself. But it's taking pretty much taking a bite. I borrowed a page from Black Panther, that lore in terms of Wakanda, and, just seeing Black individuals, in a different light. And that's really what the goal of this book was just to portray us in a more positive light, a light where we are actually change agents as opposed to being looked down upon. So that's really where we're going with this. And as we get through this book, you actually see where I'm trying to go with it. But as always, I always want to encourage you guys. It's best when you go to jafaulkerson.wordpress.com/store and purchase copies of this book. Us independent writers, we put a lot into these things, and our hope is that we can build an audience, for our product. And that's really what I'm hoping these readings do, is just kind of give you a sense of what's in the book. And I want to encourage you guys to, and ladies, to go buy the book. And hopefully sometime in the future, I will kind of touch base with some people who have purchased the book. You can get a sense of what they thought about, what I wrote down, and we'll go from there. But thanks again for listening and kind of getting a feel of Adinkrahene Fear of a Black Planet. And I look forward to doing this again in the next few days. Now take care.